He had hailed over 300 rides since returning home, but never once did he freeze like this. Sitting in the back of a battered Toyota Corolla, Army veteran Wade Collins's heart stopped the moment he saw the jagged scar on the Uber driver's neck. It wasn't the scar itself. It was the precise curve, the faint but unmistakable shape beneath it, and the memory it carved open like a scalpel. That scar wasn't random. It was identical to the unit mark, worn by his long-lost Delta Force brother-in-arms, presumed dead over a decade ago in a covert operation that never made the headlines. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain outside the window blurred everything, but nothing could distort the clarity of what Wade was seeing right in front of him. In a flash, he was no longer in Cincinnati traffic. He was back in the arid, hellish borderlands of northern Syria, surrounded by dust and gunfire, running through ruined alleyways, with a team of 5 elite soldiers, each of them bound by loyalty deeper than blood. Their unit had no name, just a number, classified, erased even from the military's own public records. Officially, they didn't exist. But Wade remembered every face, every mission, every loss, and among those faces, there was one that haunted him more than any other. Caleb Rourke. A combat medic turned silent guardian, Caleb had once pulled Wade from the wreckage of a collapsed building after an airstrike and carried him 2 miles under enemy fire. Wade remembered the night Caleb disappeared. One minute they were securing a rooftop. The next, there was an explosion, a fireball, and chaos. Command said there were no remains, no trace. They all assumed Caleb had died. They grieved him. Wade carried the weight of that loss with him, a phantom limb he could never quite let go of. And now, here he was. This Uber driver, with thinning hair, unshaven cheeks, and a face weighed down by time and silence, bore the same exact scar Wade remembered Caleb receiving years ago from a blade in close combat. The Uber driver hadn't said much beyond confirming Wade's destination, but something about his voice, raspy and low, hit a nerve too. Wade hadn't heard Caleb speak in over 12 years, but there was a cadence in this man's words that vibrated through Wade's chest like the echo of a long-forgotten frequency. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, not making eye contact, but scanning, like a man who never truly left the battlefield. Wade knew that look because he wore it himself every day. There was pain behind those eyes, but also instinct. And survival. Mafe. Wade's heart pounded. Logic told him he was being irrational. There were thousands of men with scars. Plenty of combat veterans turned to gig driving to stay afloat. And yet, that mark. That precise curved line across the collarbone, intersected with the faint burn-shaped crescent. Only one man had that. Wade hadn't thought about the shape in years, but the moment he saw it, it came back with photographic precision. That scar wasn't just any scar. It was the result of a firefight in Ghouta, a brutal encounter where Caleb had been injured shielding a civilian. Wade had seen the wound as they patched him up behind an abandoned pharmacy. There was no mistaking it. As the Uber rolled down Eastwood Avenue, a quiet part of town lined with fading brick storefronts and rusting signage, Wade sat frozen, staring at the back of the driver's head. He wanted to speak. He wanted to lean forward and say his name. But fear pinned him in place. What if he was wrong? What if this man wasn't Caleb at all? What if dredging up a ghost did more harm than good? Or worse, what if it was Caleb, and he didn't want to be found? There were dozens of reasons a man might fake his own death: survival, trauma, guilt. Wade had seen soldiers crack under pressure, vanish into new lives like shadows into dusk. The classified nature of their operations made it easy to disappear. But for Caleb, the most loyal of them all, to abandon his brothers without a word? It never made sense. And maybe that's why Wade had never found peace. Deep down, he had never truly believed Caleb was gone. Just lost. The car slowed at a red light. Wade's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He clenched his fists, trying to gather the courage to speak, to call out the name buried in his chest like shrapnel. Instead, the silence stretched like barbed wire between them, taut with tension and fear. The driver adjusted the radio, static crackling before a soft jazz tune emerged. Wade blinked. Caleb had always hated jazz. He called it background noise for ghosts. But then again, people change, especially ghosts. The light turned green, and the car rolled forward. Wade had 20 more blocks to decide whether to open a door to the past or let it close forever. His grip tightened around his knee, pulse racing like gunfire in his ears. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a moment 12 years in the making. Whether it ended in answers or more pain, Wade knew one thing. He couldn't stay silent much longer. He leaned forward an inch. "Excuse me," he finally whispered, the words trembling on his lips. The driver didn't respond, only flicked his eyes toward the mirror. In that fleeting glance, Wade saw something flicker. Recognition? Alarm? Regret? It was gone too fast to read, but it was enough. Wade swallowed hard. Whatever happened next, nothing in his life would be the same. Wade Collins had always been a man who preferred silence over noise, observation over reaction. Even before the war, he was the type who stood on the edges of rooms, scanning the mood before speaking. At 39, his face had the wear of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. Deep lines sat beneath his eyes, not from age, but from memory. Each one a quiet record of years lived with ghosts. His morning routine was as disciplined as his Delta training had once required. Wake at 5, jog for 2 miles rain or shine, black coffee from the same diner, and then a rotating list of activities that kept his mind busy but his life stagnant. He lived alone in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a brick building in northern Cincinnati. The walls were bare except for a faded American flag and a framed photo of 5 men in camouflage, arms slung over each other's shoulders, faces dirtied with the sweat of desert warfare, their grins defiant. Caleb stood in the middle of them, alive, laughing, and impossibly young. Wade kept that photo in the hallway, across from the bathroom mirror, so he'd see it each time he dried his hands. Though years had passed since he was discharged from the military, the routines had never left him. Civilian life never quite fit, like wearing a borrowed suit one size too small. Wade had tried a handful of jobs, warehouse work, security, even construction, but none held meaning. He wasn't chasing purpose anymore, just noise to drown the thoughts. Every now and then, he volunteered at the local VA hospital, reading to the older vets or helping them walk their laps around the courtyard. They called him Quiet Wade, which was fine with him. He didn't need to be the center of attention. He only needed to be useful. Lay Dopser, his neighbors barely knew his name. There was the elderly widow 2 doors down who waved politely when he carried her groceries up the steps, and a college kid across the hall who blasted music late into the night and never made eye contact. Wade didn't mind. The solitude gave him room to think, and thinking, while dangerous, was his default mode. On weekends, he'd sit by the river for hours, watching the water pass, the current moving endlessly forward as if trying to escape the past. Sometimes he'd bring a notebook, not to write in, but to hold. He had tried writing once, pouring fragments of memory onto the page in blocky handwriting, names, coordinates, feelings. But the words never captured the weight of those days, so he gave up. Still, holding the notebook gave him the illusion of control, of readiness. Wade's body bore the legacy of war in quiet ways. A faint limp on rainy days. A scar that curled behind his right ear from shrapnel. A shoulder that never quite healed after a parachute landing went wrong. But none of these were as permanent as the wounds inside, those invisible fractures left by betrayal, confusion, and survivor's guilt. He never spoke of them. Not to therapists, not to family, and certainly not to friends, most of whom had drifted away over time, not knowing how to bridge the chasm that war had opened in him. Caleb's disappearance had been the worst blow. Wade had seen death before, had buried brothers and watched others lose their minds under pressure, but Caleb, he was different. He was the glue that held their unit together. Level-headed, brutally efficient, but also the first to crack a joke when the silence got too loud. He was a man who believed in service the way others believed in religion. Losing him in that rooftop explosion had shattered more than just their team. It had broken something fundamental in Wade, a belief in justice, in closure. Even after they were airlifted out, even after the medals and the interviews and the debriefs, Wade never felt resolution. He had searched, quietly, obsessively, for any sign that Caleb had survived. Dead or alive, he needed answers. But the files were sealed. The brass gave him nothing. Classified was the word stamped on every document. No body, no last words, just smoke and silence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was only after 3 years of digging that Wade gave up. He boxed away the few mementos of their unit, stored the uniforms, and tried to build a civilian life on the shaky foundation of unanswered questions. He hadn't looked at Caleb's file in years. He hadn't needed to. He had memorized every line. That's why today, this ride, this scar, this man, wasn't just a coincidence. It was the crack in a wall Wade had stopped trying to climb. He had never believed in fate. Fate, to him, was the excuse people used to explain what they couldn't control. But this was different. This felt like a door slowly creaking open after years of being nailed shut. And the fear that rose in his chest wasn't from the unknown. It was from the possibility that the truth was finally within reach, and he wasn't sure what it would cost to grab it. As the Uber continued through the wet streets, Wade leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening. He replayed the glimpse of the scar over and over in his mind, matching it to memories that had never faded. His instincts, trained to sense threat, patterns, hidden details, were screaming. But louder than those instincts was something deeper, hope. A hope so fragile, it almost hurt to feel it. If that man was Caleb, then everything Wade thought he knew about the past was about to be rewritten. And if he wasn't, if this was just another ghost chasing him down a wet boulevard, then maybe Wade had finally lost whatever grip on reality he had left. Either way, he couldn't ignore it. Not this time. Not again. So Wade en boulevard slur. He would speak. He had to. But not yet. First, he needed to be sure. TMD en boulevard slur. The city of Cincinnati in late fall was a mosaic of muted grays and washed-out reds, the skyline perpetually smeared by low-hanging clouds, and the scent of rain clinging to every surface. The streets were still slick from the morning downpour, puddles gathering in uneven asphalt, mirroring blurred neon signs from aging storefronts. Traffic hummed in a kind of tired rhythm, not hurried but persistent, just like the people who inhabited the city. Cincinnati wasn't a city that demanded attention. It had long since surrendered its spotlight to places like New York and Chicago. But it was dependable, grounded in its grit, and Wade had chosen it for exactly that reason. It didn't ask questions. It offered anonymity without judgment. He lived on the northern edge of the city in a neighborhood called Red Bank, a strip of old factories turned apartment lofts and corner markets run by families who'd been there for generations. The kind of place where the same woman rang up your groceries every Tuesday and remembered if you bought 1 carton of milk or 2. It was safe, if a little rundown, with chain-link fences guarding cracked basketball courts and a row of townhouses that sagged like tired bones. Most of the residents kept their heads down, working double shifts and raising families under roofs that needed patching, surrounded by streets that carried the echoes of better decades. Every morning, Wade would walk past the old train tracks behind the Dollar Saver, where rusted boxcars sat abandoned like relics of a forgotten war. There was graffiti on every wall, layered like sediment, years of rebellion scrawled in angry spray paint. He liked it here. There was history in the rot, stories in the peeling paint. It felt honest, real, like him. Tedabutta. On weekends, he ventured further downtown, where the Riverwalk offered the only real escape from the heaviness of the inner city. The Ohio River snaked along the edge like a lazy sentinel, its surface broken only by drifting leaves or the occasional barge sliding past like a shadow. There were benches under the trees, and Wade often sat for hours, coffee in hand, watching strangers pass by. Joggers, couples, old veterans with canes, they all had somewhere to be, and yet, here they were, moving in slow waves, drawn to the river's quiet pull. The skyline loomed in the background, cranes constantly adding to its reach, yet somehow failing to change the city's soul. Progress here was always cosmetic. The VA hospital where Wade volunteered was nestled in Clifton Heights, a sprawling brick building with too many windows and not enough light inside. It was functional but dated, the kind of place where paint peeled from handrails and the coffee machine was perpetually out of order. But inside those walls was a different world. Men and women who spoke in abbreviations and silences, who understood each other in a way the outside world never could. Wade didn't talk much there, but he didn't need to. He'd sit beside a man who lost both legs in Fallujah, or play cards with a Marine who refused to speak since returning from Kandahar. Their stories hung in the air like secondhand smoke, heavy, invisible, inhaled with every breath. Then there was the diner on Mercer Avenue, where Wade got his morning coffee. It wasn't anything special, a narrow place with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked since 2011. But it was run by a woman named Sherry, who knew Wade by name and never asked about his past. She poured his coffee before he even reached the counter, slid it to him without a word, and smiled like she meant it. Sometimes that was enough to get him through the day. The city itself was changing, albeit slowly. There were new condos sprouting up near downtown, overpriced cafes trying to sell authenticity to young professionals who'd never been east of Vine Street before. Wade avoided those places. He stuck to the older parts of the city, the weathered edges where people didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. That was where he felt most at home, where the lies had all been spent and all that remained was the truth, even if it was ugly. And then there was the ride. This particular Uber ride that had begun on the corner of 12th and Baldwin, in front of a shuttered bookstore that now sold discount mattresses. Wade had called it out of habit, preferring the back seat of a stranger's car over crowded buses or awkward cab drivers who always wanted to talk. But as soon as he slid into the seat behind the driver, something shifted. The city he thought he knew, the roads he'd memorized, began to blur. Each block they passed looked familiar but somehow unreal, like a dream wrapped in fog. They crossed into Mount Auburn, passing rows of brownstone buildings with ivy creeping up the sides. Old churches stood between liquor stores and corner bodegas, their stained glass cracked but still glowing when the sun managed to break through. It was in these quiet corridors that Wade felt the stirrings of something old. The kind of sensation you get when walking into a room you haven't seen since childhood, a rush of knowing without memory. The car itself was worn, with cigarette burns in the upholstery and a dashboard covered in dust. A faded pine tree air freshener hung from the mirror, swaying gently with each turn. The driver said little, focused on the road, but Wade noticed the subtle things, the way his eyes scanned the rear view with precision, the slight twitch of his left hand as he gripped the wheel, the way his shoulders remained rigid even at stoplights. These were not the behaviors of a civilian. This was muscle memory from a life lived on high alert. Das war his eyesore. And all of it, the streets, the air, the silence inside the car, felt like a prelude, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for Wade to make a move. No, he didn't know where the road was truly leading yet, but the environment around him, the cracked pavement, the rusting bridges, the city scarred but standing, felt like a mirror. And somewhere within this landscape, This Uber, this driver with the impossible scar, was the answer to a question that had haunted him for over a decade. Wade had learned long ago that enemies didn't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wore suits. Sometimes they were hidden behind computer screens, whispering orders under the guise of national interest. But the most dangerous kind of antagonist, the one that changed him forever, was the kind that didn't exist on paper. The kind that could deny, erase, manipulate. That kind had a name once. Colonel Devon Harlan. To the world, he was a decorated leader, a strategic mind responsible for key operations in several classified theaters. But to Wade and what was left of Unit 23X, an off-the-books Delta team formed for missions so covert even Congress was blind, Harlan was the reason everything went wrong. Harlan didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He issued calm, confident directives, all framed in patriotism and necessity. But behind that composed demeanor was a man who played chess with human lives. The unit had trusted him at first, respected his intellect, even admired his ability to always stay 3 steps ahead. It wasn't until after the Ghouta mission, after Caleb vanished and the entire operation was marked, compromised, that the cracks began to show. The mission parameters had shifted mid-operation, orders changed without explanation. The team was instructed to abandon local assets they had sworn to protect. Wade had questioned it, but Harlan brushed off concerns with promises that the bigger picture demanded sacrifice. When they tried to extract Caleb and 2 other men during the chaos, Command ordered an immediate retreat. Then the feed went dark. No backup, no recon, no recovery. Just radio silence, followed by an internal message marked, "Mission complete. All operatives accounted for." Except they weren't. Caleb's body was never recovered. The others, Grant and Sosa, were listed as KIA pending confirmation, but their tags were never found. Wade and the remaining team members knew something was off. The timing, the shutdown, the lack of recovery effort, it didn't fit protocol, but when they raised questions, they were met with administrative walls. After debriefing, they were separated, reassigned, and eventually discharged under various pretenses. Wade had pushed harder, filing unofficial requests, tracking down connections, even using encrypted military forums to contact former allies. But the deeper he dug, the faster his trail turned cold. Files were redacted, access revoked. He got a polite call from a Pentagon liaison warning him to, quote, "stand down for the sake of operational integrity." That was the phrase that confirmed everything. Wade had heard that phrase once before, during a Black Ops mission in Uzbekistan, where civilians were accidentally caught in the crossfire and the official response was silence. Operational integrity always meant something was being buried. Harlan disappeared from views soon after, no public profile, no interviews. Rumors said he'd retired to private consulting, military contracting, foreign security assessments, vague corporate alliances that kept his hands clean and his pockets full. Wade suspected something darker. He'd seen hints that Harlan had gone rogue, possibly aligning with foreign entities, selling information. The Ghouta mission had smelled like a betrayal, like a setup. And if Caleb had survived somehow, if he had known something, seen something, then Harlan would have every reason to erase him. That possibility kept Wade awake for years. It wasn't just grief. It was the suspicion that Caleb's death wasn't a loss in combat, but the result of a betrayal at the highest level. That changed everything. It made Wade question not just Harlan, but the system that protected him. The system that called people like Wade heroes until their usefulness expired, and then filed them away with silence and a pension. The system that could sacrifice soldiers without accountability. And here, in this moment, inside a rusted Uber creeping through city streets, that history had come surging back. If the man driving was Caleb, then everything Wade suspected was true, because there was no logical reason for Caleb to be alive and hiding, unless he was running from something. Unless he had seen something that made survival a liability. Unless Harlan or someone like him had a reason to want him gone. The antagonist, then, wasn't just a man. It was a legacy of betrayal, a web of silence spun by men who operated above consequence. It was the hollow truth that Wade had tried to bury in late-night jogs and forgotten coffee cups. And now, that truth was slamming into him harder than any firefight he'd survived. Caleb wasn't just a ghost. He was possibly the last remaining witness to whatever really happened that night in Syria. And if that was the case, then Wade wasn't just chasing closure anymore. He was caught in something far more dangerous. The idea that Harlan, or the network he represented, might still be active made Wade's stomach churn. If they had eyes on Caleb, and Caleb had surfaced, even unintentionally, then time was already against them. The scar was a clue, yes, but it was also a mark, a trace of the past that someone might be watching for. Wade knew better than to assume he was the only one looking. And if Caleb had stayed hidden this long, the question became, why now? Why surface? Why drive in plain sight unless desperation had replaced caution? This, then, was the conflict Wade had unknowingly stepped into. The man in the front seat wasn't just a former comrade. He might be the last thread of truth left. And truth, in this world, was dangerous currency. If Wade was right, then simply riding in this car had already put a target on his back. And if he was wrong, if this was some terrible mistake, then it still meant one thing. The war he thought he left behind wasn't finished. It had simply gone underground. The Uber turned past an old industrial yard, chain-link fences topped with barbed wire casting shadows across the windshield. Wade stared ahead, senses sharpened. His hands stopped shaking. The fear had turned into focus now. There was something here, something real. The past had just pulled up to the curb, and it wasn't finished with him yet. For all the uncertainty spinning inside Wade's head, there was a strange familiarity in the pattern of what was happening. The tension, the scanning of body language, the interpretation of silence, these were not new to him. It was a language he had spoken for years on the battlefield, a system of cues and responses honed through necessity. And now, after years of forced normalcy, it had all returned with startling clarity, as if a switch had been flipped, and the dormant soldier inside him had awakened fully, ready and alert. Every move the driver made, the subtle, calculated glances in the rearview mirror, the occasional pause before a lane change, the careful control of speed, reminded Wade of mission transport protocols. It was the same cautious precision a field operative used when they suspected a tail, when the air around them thickened with danger, and when one mistake could mean the difference between vanishing into the crowd or never making it home again. Wade noted how the driver never turned on the overhead light when the car passed beneath a bridge, never touched his phone, never engaged in small talk like most rideshare drivers did. There was no music aside from the brief jazz earlier which had since faded back to silence. The car was clean, too clean, with no signs of personal effects. Most drivers had something, a phone charger dangling from the console, an energy drink in the cup holder, a pair of sunglasses tossed on the dash. But this vehicle was almost clinical in its emptiness. That, too, told Wade something. This wasn't someone working for tips. This was someone avoiding notice. Someone who wanted each interaction to be quick, efficient, and forgettable. The ride passed through familiar terrain, over the Brent Spence Bridge, down past the University Hospital, then into the quieter outskirts of the city, where warehouses and storage facilities stood like sentinels. Wade gave an address for a shipping facility, a location he sometimes used as a drop-off when he didn't want to go home directly. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit, a survival pattern rooted in the old days, when you never went straight to your safe house after a mission. Change the route, switch vehicles, observe who might be following. He'd almost forgotten the rhythm of that life, but now, it was pulsing in his bones again, like an old song rising from a half-buried radio. And the strange part was, this felt natural. The ritual of suspicion, the way his mind calculated risk with each turn, how he cataloged exit points and scanned reflections for threats, it didn't feel like overreaction. It felt like slipping into a well-worn uniform. There was a time, long ago, when he and Caleb had executed this same ritual together, often wordlessly. One would drive, the other would monitor. They had signals. 2 fingers tapped against the thigh meant abort. A look held too long in the mirror meant eyes on. And now Wade found himself instinctively responding to signals the driver didn't even know he was giving. But the deeper ritual, the one that had shaped Wade's years after the military, was the pattern of searching. For the first few years after his discharge, Wade had made it his silent mission to uncover anything about Caleb. He kept a notebook, hidden under a loose floorboard in his apartment, that documented every fragment of information he could collect. Phone numbers, old base contacts, redacted mission files copied illegally during a brief visit to a friend's office at the Pentagon. Every scrap was dated, logged, and indexed. And every time he hit a dead end, the process started again. He never talked about this search, never wrote about it online, never shared it with anyone, because part of him knew how it sounded, that he was obsessed with chasing a ghost. But he didn't care. The pattern had sustained him. It gave him purpose. Until eventually, it didn't. Leads dried up. Contacts stopped returning calls. A former intelligence officer who owed him a favor suddenly moved out of the country without notice. The entire trail went cold in a way that didn't feel accidental. So Wade packed the notebook away, forced himself to let go. Or tried to. The ritual of watching, of analyzing, never really left him. He just stopped actively seeking. And now, the very thing he had convinced himself was a closed chapter had reopened in front of him with all the subtlety of a sniper's crack. In the front seat, the driver adjusted the mirror again. Wade didn't miss how his knuckles tightened slightly, how his posture stiffened at certain intersections. There was a rhythm to it, a cycle of alertness that mirrored Wade's own. It wasn't paranoia, it was recognition. It was one soldier reading the instincts of another, silently communicating in a language no civilian would understand. But there was another ritual, one Wade wasn't prepared to acknowledge yet, the ritual of grief. Every year, on the anniversary of the Ghouta mission, Wade would pour a glass of scotch, sit in front of that photo of the team, and stay awake until dawn. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just remembered. He would replay every second of that mission in his head, examining it like a detective returning to a cold case, trying to figure out if there had been a sign, a clue, a moment when he should have known Caleb was alive. But that night always ended the same way, with silence, a headache, and the sick weight of powerlessness. Today, that ritual had been disrupted. Today, he was sitting less than 3 feet behind a man whose scar matched the one burned into his memory. A man whose silence wasn't just familiar, it was encoded with a story Wade had yet to hear, and that disruption had sparked a new ritual. Confrontation. But not yet. First, he needed proof. First, he needed to be sure this wasn't a hallucination conjured by years of longing and guilt. First, he had to let the pattern play out. The Uber slowed near a construction zone. Wade watched the driver's hand instinctively drift toward the side of his seat, near the lever where a weapon might once have been holstered. It was a tiny movement, automatic, unconscious, but Wade caught it. That was muscle memory. That was training. That was confirmation. The ritual was unfolding, just as it had 1,000 times in the past, on foreign soil under hostile skies. Observe, confirm, then act. Wade had done this before, but never with stakes this personal, never with the past this close, never with the chance to finally break the pattern. The only question now was whether Caleb, if it really was him, was still following the same rituals, or if he had learned to abandon them entirely. The city bled into the horizon as the Uber curved through an industrial zone, the sun low and hidden behind thick clouds that painted everything in a dull silver haze. The streets were quieter here, Less traffic, fewer pedestrians, only the occasional truck groaning past warehouses and fenced-in lots. Wade knew this area well. It was a tactical blind spot, a place where visibility dropped, where the cameras thinned out, where GPS signals sometimes lagged. He'd chosen this route deliberately. Years of operational training had conditioned him to think this way. Always control the terrain, always dictate the field. But today, that sense of control was slipping. Not because he wasn't prepared, but because of who was sitting just a few feet ahead. One silent heartbeat away from turning his entire understanding of the past upside down. As they neared the turnoff toward the rail yards, Wade's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it, then hesitated and checked it. It was a message from a name he hadn't seen in 2 years. Isla Hendricks, a former CIA field analyst who'd once run Overwatch on some of Unit 23X's most covert operations. Isla wasn't just a colleague, she was one of the few people Wade trusted completely. She'd been the one to dig deeper with him into Caleb's disappearance before the doors slammed shut, before the pressure to stop asking questions had reached both their doorsteps. Isla had a knack for finding things others couldn't. She saw the world in code and subtext, always searching for what wasn't being said. And now, her message was simple, but jarring. "We need to talk. It's about Caleb." No greeting, no sign-off, just a few words that detonated in his brain like a flashbang. Wade stared at the message, then back at the rearview mirror, locking eyes with the driver for a half-second before the man looked away. The timing was impossible to ignore. Isla hadn't contacted him in over 2 years, ever since she'd been reassigned under suspicious circumstances after a data breach that, as far as Wade could tell, had never officially happened. She'd gone off-grid not long after, leaving no digital trace, vanishing the way only someone with high clearance and enough paranoia could. For her to surface now, today of all days, meant she had seen something, or someone, and if she was reaching out, it meant the firewall had finally cracked. The arrival of Isla in this moment, even just as a message, shifted the entire axis of the situation. She wasn't just another contact, she was a witness. A living repository of buried files, encrypted records, and unspoken truths. And if she was back in the picture, it meant Wade wasn't the only one who had started asking questions again. Perhaps more importantly, it meant someone else might already be on the move, someone who didn't want those questions answered. Wade responded with a single word, "Where?" and tucked the phone away. His mind began spinning through the implications. If Isla knew something new about Caleb, then she may have been tracking him long before Wade recognized the scar. That meant Caleb, or whoever this man was, had likely surfaced in some network Isla was monitoring. Surveillance cameras, border activity, digital traces. She had tools Wade didn't. The fact that she reached out now suggested urgency. But there was something else gnawing at him too. If Isla was watching, others could be watching as well. Maybe she wasn't the first to notice Caleb had resurfaced. Maybe this wasn't a coincidence after all. The Uber turned down an alley behind a self-storage facility, where Wade had requested to be dropped. He didn't live here. He didn't even have a unit. But this was a spot he'd used before as a checkpoint, a neutral space to observe, to confront, to prepare. The buildings stood like silent sentries, rows of steel doors flanked by barbed wire and motion sensor lights. It was the kind of place where cameras were too old to stream live, and where the police response time was measured in slow minutes. As the vehicle slowed to a stop, Wade studied the driver again. The man's face was still composed, but there was a tightness now in his jaw, a subtle glance at the side mirror, then the rear view, as though measuring risk. Wade knew that look. It was the exact expression soldiers wore just before the breach, just before a door was kicked down and everything erupted. The air inside the car had grown heavier, silence thick with anticipation. But Wade didn't speak yet. He needed confirmation, a signal, something small but undeniable. He reached slowly into his coat pocket and retrieved a coin. It was a challenge coin from Unit 23X, a custom engraving never issued through official channels, just one of 5 that had ever existed. Each man in the unit had one. Wade's had scuff marks along the rim from years of use, but the emblem in the center, a hawk striking downward over a shattered chessboard, was still clear. A symbol they had created themselves, never recorded, never shared beyond their circle. Wade held it between his fingers, then leaned forward and gently placed it on the center console where the driver could see it. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The driver stiffened. His hands froze on the wheel. For the first time, his composure cracked, not visibly, but deeply. The smallest tremor passed through his shoulders, and for a moment, he just stared at the coin, not with curiosity, but with recognition. Wade saw the flicker in his eyes, a flash of pain, memory, fear. He didn't pick up the coin. Instead, he slowly reached to turn off the ignition, the soft click of the engine stopping, sounding far louder than it should have. Then he sat in silence, one hand still resting on the steering wheel, the other in his lap. The man didn't turn around, but he didn't need to. His silence now said more than words ever could. Wade knew it was him. After 12 years, 3 deployments, a lifetime of guilt, and a city full of ghosts, he was sitting 3 feet from Caleb Rourke. The witness had arrived, and with him came the weight of a story long buried. One that Wade was finally ready to hear, if Caleb was ready to speak. The silence that filled the car was so dense, so absolute, it seemed to muffle even the outside world. The distant hum of a truck engine faded, the rustle of leaves in the alley vanished, and the occasional honk or siren from the city beyond the storage yard felt as though it belonged to another lifetime. Inside the vehicle, only breath and memory remained. Wade didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the man in front of him, the man who, until this moment, existed only in faded photographs, failed rescue reports, and a decade of unanswered questions. And now he was here, in the flesh, just feet away, his shoulders rigid, his jaw tight, his silence screaming, Miarolufk. The coin between them might as well have been a detonator. Its presence stripped away every defense the man had held since Wade entered the car. Wade saw it in the way his grip on the steering wheel loosened, in the slow breath he exhaled through his nose, in the subtle tremor in his right hand. There was no feigned confusion, no attempt to deny or dismiss. The coin was proof, undeniable, sacred. It wasn't something a stranger would recognize. Only one of them would know what it meant, and that recognition, shared, silent, shattering, was more than enough. The man finally reached for the coin, his fingers brushing it not with familiarity, but with reverence, as though it were a relic from a past life. He picked it up slowly, turned it over once in his hand, then let it rest in his palm. Wade watched his every move, searching for something: guilt, relief, anger. What he saw was something deeper, a kind of resignation, like a dam breaking behind the eyes, a truth long kept finally recognizing that it could no longer be held. The man turned toward him at last, just slightly, just enough that Wade could see his profile in full. The beard was longer now, the face more gaunt, aged beyond its years, but the structure was the same. The eyes were unmistakable. Same gray-blue, same deep-set intensity, same haunted weight behind them. Wade knew those eyes better than he knew his own reflection. It was Caleb. The scar confirmed it, the thin white line that curved from the man's temple to behind his ear, barely visible under the hairline, the exact scar Caleb had taken in an explosion 2 years before Ghouta. Wade had treated it himself in the back of a Humvee during a mission gone sideways in Helmand Province. That scar was never documented in any official file. No one else would know it existed. And yet here it was, weathered and real, a silent testament to a life everyone else thought ended in Syria. Wade's heart beat so hard it felt like it might crack through his ribs. There was a strange sensation flooding his chest, not quite relief, not quite joy, It was something rawer, sharper, a collision of anger and disbelief, of awe and grief. Because this wasn't just a reunion, it was a resurrection, and all the years of mourning, all the hours Wade had spent blaming himself, questioning command, doubting his own memory, every one of them now collapsed into this moment. Caleb opened his mouth as if to speak, but stopped. The words weren't there yet, not after 12 years of hiding, of silence. His lips moved, his brow furrowed, and for a moment he simply looked down at the coin again. Then, in a voice hoarse with disuse, he spoke a name, Wade's name. Just that. One syllable, almost reverent, and with it came the full force of the truth. Wade leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The sound of his name from Caleb's lips was both a confirmation and a trigger. Memories surged up like a flood. Missions they'd run, nights they'd spent under desert stars, the way Caleb used to call out coordinates mid-battle, calm and unshakable even when the world was on fire. He was the moral compass of their unit, the man they all followed without question. And now, here he was, calling Wade's name like a tether to reality after floating through years of exile. Wade wanted to ask 100 questions. Where have you been? Why didn't you come back? What really happened that night? But the moment was too delicate, the air between them too fragile. One wrong word and the weight of it all might shatter the tenuous connection finally forming again. So instead, Wade said the only thing that felt honest. I never stopped looking. The words hung in the air, heavier than he expected. Caleb nodded once, eyes flickering with something Wade hadn't seen in years. Something like gratitude. Then Caleb reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out an old, frayed photograph. Wade recognized it instantly. The same photo that hung in his hallway. The 5 of them, arms over shoulders, smiling like fools in the middle of chaos. But this one had a note scribbled on the back. Caleb turned it around and handed it to him without speaking. Wade read the message slowly. It wasn't long. Some things you bury to protect the truth, others to survive it. His throat clenched. This wasn't just confirmation that Caleb had survived. It was an admission that he had chosen to stay hidden. That everything, his disappearance, the silence, the years of absence, had been part of something larger. A plan, perhaps. Or maybe just a desperate attempt to outrun a system that wanted him gone. Wade looked up, and for the first time, Caleb met his eyes directly. It was all there now. Not just recognition, not just survival, but the pain of isolation, the weight of having to become invisible. And behind it, just beneath the surface, something else, something dangerous. A truth Wade hadn't uncovered yet, one that Caleb hadn't spoken, but was clearly ready to reveal. Not tonight, maybe not even this week. But soon. Wade didn't smile. He didn't cry, but something inside him finally shifted. The ache of not knowing, the sickness of unfinished grief. It cracked open just enough to let in light. Caleb was alive, and the story wasn't over. Yeah. The city was beginning to darken now, twilight rolling in like a slow tide as the last fragments of sunlight drained from the alley behind the storage yard. Above them, sodium lamps flickered to life one by one, casting long, bent shadows across the concrete and chain-link fences. But inside the car, neither Wade nor Caleb moved. The recognition had passed, but it left behind something brittle, something electric. The air between them had shifted. No longer uncertain, no longer filled with doubt, but instead braced for what was coming next. There was no question now that Caleb had faked his death, had vanished deliberately, and had stayed gone for reasons that weren't just personal. Something was coming. And Wade knew they wouldn't have much time before the outside world caught up to this fragile reunion. Doggo. Caleb broke the silence first, though not with an answer. He muttered a location, an address across the river in Kentucky, in the hills near Bellevue, then started the engine without another word. Wade didn't argue. There was no point pressing questions in the open. Not with cameras in every alley and ears that didn't need to be visible to be listening. The car eased back into traffic, heading south, the Ohio River reflecting the bruised sky as they crossed the bridge and slipped into the wooded backroads. Wade didn't need to ask how Caleb knew where to go. This was the kind of movement they used to make regularly, quick, quiet, and off-grid. The safe house was a weathered hunting cabin tucked into a dense patch of timber, invisible from the main road unless you knew exactly where to look. Wade had kept it as a fallback location, used only once before during a surveillance tale gone wrong 3 years back. That Caleb knew of its existence meant he hadn't been as far away as Wade once thought. It meant he'd been watching, at least for a while. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and dust. The floorboards creaked underfoot as Caleb moved to the far wall, his back always toward a solid structure. An old instinct, never let your six be exposed. Wade watched him move, noting again the efficiency, the quiet strength, and the way he scanned the room once before speaking. And when he did, it came out flat, steady, like a briefing. Nahumida, I wasn't the only one who made it out of Ghouta. Sosa did too, but we split up after the extraction was burned. Grant didn't make it. I saw the drone feed. They used the strike to cover our disappearance. Wade's heart twisted at the name. Grant had been the youngest of the team, a demolitions expert with a quiet smile and a habit of humming to himself during missions. His death had never felt right. Too fast, too clean. Wade stayed quiet, letting Caleb continue. They wanted us dead. That strike wasn't a mistake. Harlan orchestrated it. We were getting too close. Ghouta wasn't just a retrieval. It was a silencing. Wade's fists clenched instinctively. It was what he had suspected all along, but never confirmed. Harlan had used their unit as bait, or worse, as a loose end that needed trimming. The mission had been too deep, too off-record. There had been rumors about a chemical weapons stash, encrypted flash drives buried in the floorboards of an abandoned compound, data that linked certain American operations with unsanctioned arms transfers. And now, the implication was clear. Caleb had taken something, information, maybe even the drives themselves, and disappeared to keep it safe. Caleb reached into a weathered duffel bag and pulled out a small, impact-proof case. He opened it, revealing 3 items: a compact hard drive, a burner phone, and a dog tag. Sosa's. Wade recognized the engraving immediately. We split the data before we ran. Sosa had a copy. I've had mine locked away for years. I moved every few months. Changed faces, names, jobs. I drove trucks in Nevada, patched fences in Kansas, bounced through half a dozen cities. The Uber gig was just a way to stay mobile, keep a pulse on the grid. I was never supposed to stay this long in Cincinnati, but I saw your name on a message board I still monitor. A flag phrase. You wrote something. Chessboard broken. That was the trigger. Wade felt cold all over. He had used that phrase in a comment thread 6 days ago, on a defunct military forum buried deep within an encrypted network. It was a test. One of the old signal phrases they had developed in case everything fell apart. He never expected a reply. Never expected it would shake someone out of hiding. But it had. Idgaf. Caleb's voice turned harder now. They're watching again. I saw a tail last week in Covington. Black SUV. No tags. No plate. Same make we used to run surveillance out of in Turkey. Whoever they are, they're getting bolder. They must have picked up a signal. Maybe yours, maybe mine. I had to surface. The escalation was clear now. The fragile bubble of obscurity Caleb had lived in was breaking. Wade understood that once you re-entered the grid, even partially, there was no going back. It was only a matter of time before those responsible, Harlan's network, or whatever had grown from it, would act to ensure that the silence held. The confrontation had begun, not with bullets, not with sirens, but with the slow unraveling of a cover story 12 years in the making. And the stakes weren't just Caleb's survival anymore. If the data in that hard drive contained what Wade suspected, it could implicate more than just Harlan. It could expose a web of operations, black contracts, and manipulated intelligence that stretched far beyond one failed mission in Syria. Wade took the drive and stared at it for a long moment. It was light, ordinary in weight, but it felt like holding a live grenade. There would be no going back now. Not after this. Not after seeing Caleb's face, hearing the truth spoken aloud for the first time. "They'll come," Caleb said quietly, his eyes on the cabin window now. "Not tonight, but soon. You and I both know how this works." Wade nodded. He did. And he also knew they were done hiding. The war had followed them home. But this time, they weren't unprepared. The following morning broke with a thick fog blanketing the Kentucky hillside, softening the harsh outlines of the trees and dulling the early light into a pale wash of gray. Wade was already awake, standing on the porch of the cabin with a mug of lukewarm black coffee in his hand, his eyes sweeping the tree line out of habit. The mug wasn't for comfort. It was just something to do with his hands, while his mind processed everything that had been said the night before. Caleb's reappearance had cracked open more than a cold case. It had reopened a version of Wade he had buried, the one who operated not in meetings and emails, but in silence and shadows. And now, that man was fully awake again. But what he hadn't expected was the clarity that came with it. The hesitation was gone. The doubt had vanished. The man standing on the porch was no longer the soldier questioning whether he had failed his friend. He was something far more dangerous. Someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. Inside the cabin, Caleb was assembling the communications setup they'd always used when working off-grid. Burner laptops, signal jamming routers, wireless interceptors with directional antennas. It was all outdated tech by modern standards, but that was the point. Too old to be easily tracked, too simple to be infected with modern malware. It was analog in spirit but precise in execution. Caleb worked in complete silence, methodical, his hands moving with the grace of someone who had rebuilt his identity more than once. Wade observed him from the doorway, noting the sharpness of each motion, the way his eyes flicked across the setup like a chess master preparing a trap. Then Wade walked back inside, set his mug down, and pulled out his old duffel, the one he hadn't touched since his official discharge. From it he retrieved a rolled canvas pouch and laid it flat on the table. One by one he unwrapped its contents: a disassembled Sig Sauer P226, a Ka-bar combat knife, a rusted compass, a broken watch with sand still stuck in the bezel, and beneath it all, folded with reverence, his service flag, faded now with time. It wasn't just a ritual. It was a reckoning. Wade was no longer a man running from the past. He was a man about to act on it. The demonstration of his character wasn't in speeches or strategy. It was in the way he rebuilt everything with his own hands. He cleaned the weapon slowly, checking for corrosion, oiling the slide, testing the magazine. He wasn't preparing for a firefight. He was preparing to take control. When Caleb glanced over, he didn't speak, but there was something in his expression, an unspoken acknowledgement. This wasn't just a reunion anymore. It was a reconvergence. The team was back, not in number, but in purpose. Wade then did something he hadn't done in years. He accessed a dormant contact line, an encrypted signal known only to two people: Isla Hendricks and a man named Porter Briggs, a former intelligence handler turned whistleblower who had once helped expose a surveillance scandal that rocked a small but powerful federal contractor. Briggs had been underground for 6 years, his location unknown, his name erased from all public registries. Wade didn't know if the channel still worked, but if it did, it would light up on a military-issue sat phone, buried in some forgotten basement in Colorado. He sent a simple string of characters: asset confirmed, ghost breathing, need extraction protocol, signal Fenrir. Fenrir was a code they had built together during the early days, when everything was theoretical, and betrayal was only a whisper. It meant everything is in motion. It meant the worst has already begun. If Briggs was alive, he would respond. If not, then they were truly alone. After sending the message, Wade moved to the cabin's back room, where he opened a floor panel and pulled out a false bottom, something he had built years ago, more out of paranoia than need. From it, he retrieved several ID packs, burner SIMs, and a black case the size of a lunchbox. Inside it was a kill switch module, a military-grade device that could wipe every digital footprint in a half-mile radius if deployed correctly. He handed it to Caleb without a word. Caleb held it for a second, then gave a curt nod and began programming it. No questions, no hesitation. Just the seamless cooperation of two men who had once depended on each other in gunfire and smoke. But the real moment came that evening, when Wade sat across from Caleb at the kitchen table and laid out a map, not just of the city, but of the military contractor networks, embassy ties, and former intelligence assets they suspected were still operating under Harlan's ghost structure. It wasn't a guessing game anymore. Wade had spent years drawing connections on his own time, quietly piecing together what the official channels wouldn't acknowledge. Deniable assets, shell corporations, congressional budgets buried in vague defense line items. Caleb studied the map, then slowly rotated it, revealing that he had been tracking some of the same names. His own notes mirrored Wade's in alarming detail. They had worked the same puzzle on opposite ends of the world, both chasing a truth that no one wanted exposed. And now, the pieces were coming together. Wade's true character wasn't just in his ability to fight. It was in his refusal to let injustice remain hidden, in his loyalty to a fallen team, in his unbreakable determination to bring light to the dark spaces carved out by power and deception. He hadn't come here to rekindle a friendship. He had come to finish what had been started all those years ago in Ghouta. He had come to bring down the ones who had turned soldiers into ghosts. Namati Tayafai Haniataya Itis. And now, with Caleb alive, with the drive in their possession, and with a re-established link to allies willing to risk everything, Wade was no longer the man they could ignore. He was the reckoning coming for them, piece by piece, truth by truth. Riven dases mus bachayama. So would see kir bihawa. They would all see. Men riven dases, way salazwan. The following week unfolded like a covert operation in slow motion. Wade and Caleb remained invisible, orbiting around the city in a precise, coordinated pattern that mimicked the very surveillance protocols they had once deployed in enemy territory. They changed locations twice daily, avoided Wi-Fi networks entirely, and spoke only when necessary, reducing verbal exchanges to a bare minimum while relying instead on muscle memory and shared intuition. But behind the silence was a growing storm, a storm powered by the contents of the hard drive Caleb had protected all these years. And as the data was decrypted, organized, and corroborated with Wade's own independent investigations, the story that emerged was more damning, more radioactive than even they had imagined. The drive didn't just contain evidence of one mission gone wrong. It was a ledger, a record of unauthorized operations spanning over a decade, many of which had been masked behind humanitarian deployments, arms control enforcement, or foreign intelligence collaborations. But within those operations, certain names appeared with troubling frequency. Harlan's was one, of course, but so too were the initials of mid-level operatives, now sitting on advisory panels, think tanks, and even congressional security boards. The evidence included mission logs scrubbed from official archives, audio clips from encrypted comms channels, and stills from thermal drone feeds that had never been released. There were also testimonies, coded voice files from other operatives who had vanished in similar patterns as Caleb, now presumed dead, but perhaps, like him, hiding in the quiet corners of the world. The final piece came in the form of a video, a helmet cam recording from the Ghouta mission, one Caleb had never intended to show anyone unless absolutely necessary. It captured the final minutes before the drone strike. In it, Caleb and Sosa could be seen dragging Grant's limp body into a reinforced tunnel beneath the compound. The timestamp clearly showed they were alive and mobile long after headquarters had declared radio silence. Then came the voice. Harlan's voice, unmistakable, issuing a direct command to fire, not for extraction, not for support, but to erase. It was calculated, cold, treasonous. Wade watched it only once. That was enough. Enough to validate the years of doubt. Enough to turn his private war into a moral crusade. Caleb had already begun assembling the final dossier, preparing the data for public release. But Wade knew better than to trust the usual platforms. Social media algorithms could be throttled. News stations could be pressured. Even whistleblower sites had been compromised in recent years. What they needed was not just exposure. They needed irrefutable vindication. A moment where the lie broke apart under the weight of undeniable proof, and the world was forced to look at what had been done in its name. Wade reached back out to Isla Hendricks. She responded within hours, her message terse but purposeful. Secure line, 1 hour, come alone. The meet took place in a glass-walled cafe at the edge of a botanical garden, a deliberate choice on Isla's part. Open visibility, no blind corners, minimal foot traffic during the early hours. Wade approached wearing a civilian jacket and a worn-out ball cap, but Isla saw right through the disguise. She looked older now, her dark curls streaked with gray, her once vivid eyes tired from too many years, fighting invisible wars from behind a screen. But when she opened her laptop and showed him the private terminal she had access to, one that routed through a series of outdated but secure military backdoors, he knew she hadn't lost a step. Wade handed her a thumb drive. "It's all there," he said, "everything they buried." Isla didn't need convincing. She trusted Wade more than she trusted her own superiors. She took the drive and got to work immediately, her fingers dancing across the keyboard, launching secure uploads to 3 different jurisdictions, each with automated deadman protocols. Then she opened a connection to someone only she could reach, a reporter from a neutral international outlet who owed her a life-saving favor from a past operation. The reporter had credibility, reach, and most importantly, independence. This wasn't going to be a smear campaign, it was going to be an explosion. Within 48 hours, the story hit. The headlines didn't use Wade's name, nor Caleb's. But the footage was there. Blurred faces, altered voices. But the message rang clear. Covert U.S. operations had knowingly executed their own operatives to prevent exposure of illegal intelligence activity. The drone strike at Ghouta had not been a tragedy. It had been an intentional silencing, approved and executed by a ring of rogue officers under the guise of national security. The files were available to download, mirrored across global servers, shared by digital activists and former military watchdogs alike. The public reaction was swift and visceral. Protests erupted near D.C. and several overseas embassies. Congressional hearings were announced. An emergency intelligence review committee was formed. And behind the scenes, names began disappearing from websites. Quiet resignations, sudden reassignments. Harlan's name never surfaced directly. He was far too cautious for that. But Wade knew the man was already burning phones, erasing connections, tightening the leash on anyone who might trace this back to him. But it was too late. Wade wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't even looking for fame. But in the quiet hours that followed the public leak, his inbox flooded with messages. From soldiers, from analysts, from widows and parents who had never been given closure about their children's final missions. People who had been told to move on, to trust the flag, to believe that what had happened was in the service of a greater good. Now they saw the truth. Now they knew. Public vindication didn't come with parades or headlines and neon lights. It came with silence, an entire system momentarily stunned by its own reflection. It came with acknowledgement, with cracks in the concrete, with the first apologies from officials who had denied everything for years. Wade didn't need applause. He just needed the lie to die. And now, finally, it had begun to rot. Taste. At the cabin, Caleb sat on the steps outside, staring at the tree line. He didn't speak when Wade returned, but Wade simply sat beside him, handed him a copy of that morning's front page, and waited. Caleb didn't read it. He didn't have to. He could feel it. The war that had followed them home was no longer a secret. The world finally knew what they had endured. And now, it was their move again. Asaph too. The days that followed were not filled with celebration or relief, but with a strange, aching quiet, the kind that settles in after a long and brutal storm. It wasn't peace. Not yet. But it was the first true stillness either man had experienced in over a decade. Wade sat on the back porch of the cabin as wind pushed through the trees, kicking up golden leaves and whispering through the branches like ghosts trying to speak. He could still feel the weight of it all in his bones, the adrenaline, the pressure, the burden of seeing a man he'd buried in his heart walk back into his life. But now, the aftermath was unfolding not just in headlines or encrypted messages, but in the subtle cracks forming across an entire power structure that had once seemed untouchable. The news cycle hadn't died down. If anything, it had evolved. While mainstream media initially tried to contain the story, international outlets picked it up like wildfire. Whistleblower organizations cross-verified the data, confirming metadata, chain of custody, even military code names long forgotten by the public but instantly recognized by those who had once served under them. Families who had been given folded flags and hollow explanations were now demanding hearings, transparency, and above all, accountability. Some of those families had already reached out to Wade directly. One mother wrote simply, "You gave my son back to me, not in body, but in truth. Thank you." Wade didn't reply. He couldn't. There were no words that could meet that kind of grief, no response that could justify the years lost to silence and misinformation. But he read the message again and again, letting it burn into his heart like a brand. That was what all of this had been for. Not revenge, not pride, but truth. Truth had a cost, yes, but so did every lie that had come before it. And now, the scales were finally shifting. Isla, for her part, disappeared again. She sent one final message before going dark. "They'll come for you eventually, but not yet. For now, they're too busy covering their own tracks." She'd never been one to linger. She lived between signals, somewhere on the edge of digital shadows and plausible deniability. But Wade knew she'd done her part. She had helped ignite a fire that couldn't be extinguished, not without drawing more attention, not without sparking something far bigger than any single scandal. And what of Caleb? He remained a man out of time, a ghost rediscovering the weight of his own skin. Now that his name was surfacing in whispers, though not yet tied directly to the video or the files, he couldn't go back to the life he'd built in hiding. The Uber account was deleted, the burner phones were destroyed, and the quiet mechanic job he once held under a false identity was gone without a trace. He spent his time at the cabin mostly in silence, whittling pieces of wood into crude figurines, fixing loose boards on the porch, listening to the forest breathe. He said little, but Wade understood. This was the cost of survival, not just anonymity, but disconnection. Yet, slowly, the consequences began to take shape in more tangible ways. 2 senators publicly called for an emergency review of covert operations within military intelligence. A Department of Defense spokesperson, clearly shaken, gave a press conference promising, quote, "full transparency and justice where necessary." Within hours, leaked documents not part of Wade's initial drop began surfacing. Others, it seemed, had held on to their own secrets, waiting for the right moment to step forward. That moment had come. And then came the arrest of Miles Carter, a mid-tier intelligence officer known for his hawkish stance on foreign intervention. He was pulled from his home in Virginia in the middle of the night, not for what he'd done during the operations themselves, but for his role in authorizing a funding channel linked to the rogue unit that carried out the strike in Ghouta. It was the first real crack in the dam, and Wade knew it wouldn't be the last. but none of it came without risk. Late one evening, Wade returned from a supply run to find the cabin's front door ajar. No signs of forced entry, no immediate threat. Just a single note pinned to the table with a Ka bar knife identical to his own. The note read, "You're not finished." No name, no signature. Just those 3 words. Wade didn't need to guess who had left it. Whether it was Harlan or one of his former lieutenants, the message was clear. This wasn't over. The system didn't forgive exposure. It simply adapted, mutated, hid behind new layers. Caleb, reading the note later that night, didn't flinch. He folded it neatly and placed it in the fire. They didn't talk about it, but the message had done its job. It reminded them that survival was not victory, and vindication did not mean freedom. The truth was now public, yes, but justice was a slow, grinding machine, and machines could be jammed, redirected, even dismantled, if you had the right leverage. The aftermath wasn't just a time of reflection. It was a time of recalibration. Wade began drafting a longer version of the full story, redacted, anonymized, but deeply personal. Not for publication, not yet, but for those who would one day ask why. For those who would wonder how good men disappeared into silence, how loyalty was punished, and how truth was nearly buried beneath drone footage and forged reports. It would be his record, his testimony, and perhaps, one day, his warning. As summer gave way to fall and the hills turned a deeper shade of amber, Wade stood on the porch again, watching the mist rise off the earth like smoke. Caleb stepped beside him, arms crossed, silent as always. But this time, there was a different energy between them. Not quite peace, not quite closure, but something steady. Something shared. They hadn't undone the past, but they had faced it. Together, and though the consequences were still unfolding, one thing was certain. The silence had been broken. The truth was out there now, too loud to be buried again. And for the first time in years, Wade felt the faintest pulse of something he hadn't known he still had. Hope. The seasons shifted slowly, and with them, so did the stories ripple through the wider world. Autumn came heavy with rain and fog, washing the hills of Kentucky in a hush of golden decay. By then, the headlines had begun to soften, fading into the margins of national news cycles, replaced by election scandals and economic forecasts. The mainstream attention moved on, as it always did, but not everyone forgot. Not the families who had buried their sons and daughters with unanswered questions. Not the junior intelligence analysts who had once sifted through flagged drone logs only to be told they'd misunderstood what they saw. Not the disillusioned young operatives who'd entered service believing in honor and justice, only to stumble upon shadows no one dared name. For them, the revelation had planted something deeper, a crack in the wall, a wedge in the machinery, and for some, a quiet resolve. Across private forums, encrypted message boards, and deep civilian-military networks, the Ghouta files became legend, not in the way of myths, but as reference points, a cornerstone case in conversations about accountability, operational ethics, and internal betrayal. Academics in war colleges used redacted versions of the data to teach about the fine line between rogue missions and sanctioned atrocities. Defense lawyers referenced the footage in appeals for whistleblowers who had been buried under charges. Advocacy groups for veterans began demanding independent audits of mission losses, previously classified as inconclusive or non-recoverable. It wasn't just a scandal. It was a shift, a slow but undeniable pull toward reckoning. And still, Wade and Caleb remained unseen, watching from the margins. The cabin in Kentucky had become less of a hiding place and more of a perch, a quiet outpost from which to observe the long arc of consequence. The men rarely spoke about what they'd done, or what they'd lost, but they understood what they had triggered. The silence that had once protected so many lies was fractured now, and through those fractures, light seeped in. Caleb had changed. Not dramatically, but deeply. He was less ghost and more man now, present in ways Wade had not expected. He began speaking more, even laughing on occasion. He started keeping a small journal, something he never shared, but that Wade saw him writing in late at night by lantern light. He fixed the cabin's roof, installed solar panels with materials from the nearby depot, and even began sketching diagrams for water filtration. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding. Quietly, deliberately. Brick by brick. One morning, without warning, Caleb handed Wade a sealed envelope. "I'm mailing this," he said. Inside was a statement. A full debrief, encoded and anonymized, addressed to the International Tribunal on War Crimes. He knew they had no jurisdiction. He knew the U.S. wouldn't acknowledge their findings even if they did investigate. But that wasn't the point. The point was record. History. A first-person account from the man who had been erased. Caleb no longer needed to disappear. He wanted his voice to exist somewhere, even if only in a sealed file in the Hague's archives, waiting for the day someone would open it and finally understand the price of silence. Wade, too, had begun moving differently. He reached back out to certain allies, former team members who had slipped into civilian life without answers. Some responded with anger, others with gratitude, but most with quiet grief. The news had reopened wounds, yes, but it had also granted something that could never be taken back. Truth. And Wade kept feeding it. Slowly. Carefully. Not through more leaks, but through mentorship, testimony, and the rebuilding of trust among those who had once worn the same patch on their shoulder. The most unexpected change came in the form of a letter. Handwritten. No return address. Huma. Wade opened it on a crisp October morning. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the story inside wasn't. It was from the daughter of a man Wade didn't remember, one of the analysts who had pieced together early versions of the drone feed evidence. Her father had tried to escalate concerns internally years before. He'd been silenced, demoted. Later, diagnosed with PTSD. He never saw the story come to light. But she had. She wrote, "You gave him peace, even after death. I just wanted you to know that." Wade read the letter 3 times before folding it neatly and placing it in the drawer beside his bunk. Ria. It was legacy. Not in the form of medals or citations, but in ripples. In slow generational awakenings. In the way truth echoed long after those who spoke it had gone quiet. Eventually, people stopped asking where the information had come from. Investigations pivoted to systems rather than individuals. But there were always whispers. About the 2 men who disappeared after the truth broke. About the possibility they were still alive, living in the woods, working quietly to dismantle the rest of the machine that had nearly destroyed them. Wade never confirmed or denied anything. He didn't have to. He and Caleb had done what needed to be done. They'd ripped the mask off a lie that had poisoned everything it touched. And now, as the world adjusted to that truth, they found purpose not in returning to the battlefield, but in preventing future wars born from the same deception. Wade planted trees now, dozens of them, along the edge of the property. Caleb built beehives and tended to them like old friends. They spoke little of the past, and even less of the war. But every once in a while, when the wind shifted just right, and the news mentioned yet another old operation being reviewed under new scrutiny, they would nod at each other, not in pride, but in affirmation. This was their legacy. Not heroism, not vengeance, but surreality. Time, once marked by gunfire and coded transmissions, now passed in softer increments. Sunlight stretching across the cabin floor, the lengthening of shadows near dusk, the low chirp of frogs echoing across the hills. Wade had adjusted to the quiet, but he had not mistaken it for peace. The world outside still moved, still hunted, still adapted, even if it did so more quietly now. The truth they had released was not a cure. It had simply cleared the fog. What followed was not healing, but reckoning, a long, unsteady process that cost more than either of them had expected. Caleb's health began to falter not long after the first frost. At first it was fatigue. Then came the shaking in his right hand, subtle at first, then more persistent. He said little about it, brushing off Wade's concern with the kind of stoic silence he'd worn like armor since the day they'd reunited. But Wade wasn't blind. He recognized the signs: years of stress, injuries untreated, toxins inhaled in war zones with no oversight. Whatever the cause, Caleb was beginning to slow in ways that could no longer be dismissed as age or weariness. His mind remained sharp, but his body was beginning to betray him, and still he worked. Every morning he rose early, stacking firewood, repairing fences, tending to the hives. He said it kept him grounded. But Wade knew the truth. Caleb was working against the inevitable, trying to outrun the slow erosion that now trailed him like a shadow. For a man who had already died once in the eyes of the world, the idea of truly fading without having finished the mission was unbearable. It was Wade who suggested the second drop. They had agreed after the first leak that they would hold back certain files, names, dates, operations so classified that even exposure risked triggering immediate reprisal. But now, with the pressure easing and certain parties exposed or exiled, it was time to release the rest. Not to the press this time, but to those who could act on it with conscience. A private international watchdog group, a retired general who had gone public with his disapproval of drone policy, and an independent war crimes unit based in Geneva. Caleb didn't object. He simply nodded, as though he'd been waiting for Wade to make that call. The second drop went out encrypted and fragmented, each recipient receiving a portion with instructions on how to assemble it, only in collaboration with the others. This was about legacy again, but also insurance. If either Wade or Caleb disappeared, the truth wouldn't. They had watched the world move once in the wake of revelation. Now they ensured it would continue to move, even without them. Still, for all the grand movements and institutional ripples, it was the personal consequences that weighed most heavily. One night, Wade received a message he hadn't expected. A voicemail, untraceable, left on a burner line they used only for non-mission communication. It was from Julia, his sister, who he hadn't spoken to in over 5 years. Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if unsure who might be listening. "I saw what you did," she said. "I don't know if you're okay. I don't know if I want to know. But I remember when we were kids and you said you wanted to be the kind of man who could make things right. I think you did. I think Dad would have been proud." The message cut off there. Wade sat in silence for a long time afterward, the phone in his hand, the weight of her words sinking in, deeper than any headline or tribunal hearing ever could. He hadn't done it for family. He hadn't done it for redemption. But to know that even from afar, someone had seen him, not the soldier, not the whistleblower, but the man beneath it all, meant more than he could explain. Caleb didn't speak of family. If he had any left, he never mentioned them. His life was tied to a different kind of bond, the unspoken, unbreakable thread that connected men forged in fire. But one evening, as they sat by the fireplace, he asked Wade to hold on to something. A small notebook, sealed with wax, marked only with coordinates. He said if anything ever happened to him, Wade would know what to do with it. Wade didn't ask questions. He just tucked it into a lockbox beside his own letters, maps, and journal entries. The private cost of truth was not always visible. It came in long silences. In the ache of old wounds reopened. In the knowledge that even when justice is served, the past does not unwind itself. It simply settles differently in the chest. And yet, there were moments, small, fleeting, when the cost felt worth it. Like the time a young man in a Cincinnati train station stopped Wade, eyes wide, and said, "You don't know me, but I watched everything. My brother was in Syria. He always said something wasn't right. Thank you." Or the package that arrived, anonymously, filled with newspaper clippings, old service records, and a medal posthumously awarded to a man named Sosa. A name that had almost been lost, now carved into memory once more. These were not rewards, they were echoes. And sometimes that was enough to keep a man going. Tua efha b'chaba. As the year edged toward its close, and frost thickened across the field, Wade stood on the cabin's porch and watched Caleb moving slower now, breath visible in the cold. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had written their names into a ledger far more permanent than history. They had carved space into a world that wanted them gone. And they had survived. Winter came down hard on the hills that year, the kind of winter that silences everything. No wind, no birdsong, just the slow, deliberate hush of snow piling on roof shingles and the soft creak of branches under ice. It was the kind of cold that made the world feel paused, suspended in a moment that refused to pass. But for Wade and Caleb, it offered something more than stillness. It offered a kind of invisibility, a temporary reprieve from the world beyond the forest, where consequences were still unraveling and powerful men were still scrambling to preserve their carefully curated legacies. Here, beneath the thick snow and beneath layers of isolation, something unexpected had begun to emerge. Life. It didn't return all at once. There was no epiphany, no grand speech or sudden burst of purpose. It came quietly, in gestures and habits that hadn't meant anything before, but now held weight. Wade, who had once only read mission files and encrypted messages, began leafing through old novels again, dog-eared books he'd brought back from deployments and never opened. He started to underline things, not for strategy, but for meaning, sentences that made him pause, ideas that settled in his chest. Caleb, whose body had begun to betray him more with each passing week, continued to push himself daily, walking the perimeter of the property, not for surveillance anymore, but simply to move, to be. He carried a thermos of hot tea, wrapped in a scarf he found in a box from the 90s, and took each step like it was an act of rebellion against time. They spoke more during those months, but not about war, not about operations or politics. They talked about the little things, the way snow sounded under boots, the birds that still stayed through the cold, what the world might be like if more people told the truth, even when it hurt. They rarely said anything profound, but their words carried more weight than any report they'd ever filed. There was a simplicity to it now. No need for code words or strategy, just honesty exchanged between two men who had seen too much and survived anyway. Around the beginning of February, something happened that neither of them could have predicted. A local journalist from a small-town Kentucky paper, someone far removed from the world of national exposés and intelligence leaks, published a feature titled, "The Quiet Men in the Hills." It was vague, filled with euphemisms, clearly written by someone who had heard whispers but couldn't verify a thing. It didn't mention names or exact locations, but it painted a portrait of two veterans who had done something important, something dangerous, and had walked away not for fear, but for peace. The article went largely unnoticed by the wider world, drowned out by more sensational headlines. But for Wade and Caleb, it felt like a ripple, a reminder that even in obscurity, their story still lingered in the public's quiet memory. Wade clipped the article, folded it into quarters, and placed it beside the letter from Julia. That same week they received a package, no sender. Inside was a bag of coffee beans, a tattered field journal, and a single note written in block letters. What you did mattered, for all of us, still in. That was the thing about legacy. It rarely arrived in applause. More often, it whispered its way through the world, changing it one person at a time. As March approached, Caleb's health dipped again. Wade took him to a VA hospital, under a fabricated identity, driving hours out of their zone just to find a place with the right kind of silence. They ran the tests. The results weren't good. Something degenerative. Slow, but irreversible. The doctor didn't ask questions about their aliases, just handed over the medication and suggested they return for a longer consult. Wade nodded, but they both knew that wouldn't happen. That night, they sat beside the fire, snow still gathered along the windowsill, and Caleb said, without warning, "We bought a little time. That's more than I expected." Wade didn't respond right away. There was nothing to say. Caleb wasn't mourning. He was just observing, like he always had, taking inventory of a moment, even as it slipped away. The slow return to life wasn't about healing completely. It was about showing up for the sunrise, about stacking wood, even when your hands shook, about trusting another person enough to say, "Hold this for me, just in case." In late March, something bloomed by the edge of the property. A wildflower, bright orange, stubborn against the cold. Caleb noticed it first, paused mid-step, pointed it out without a word. They watched it for a long time, one tiny sign of life, insisting on its place in a landscape that had forgotten how to breathe color. By April, Wade had resumed writing again, not just notes or encrypted summaries, but long-form letters to no one. He wrote about silence, about truth, about how some men survive wars only to find they don't know what to do with peace. And he wrote about Caleb, describing him not as a soldier, but as a mirror. A man who had lost everything and still chose to build something out of what was left. Metaxavier Darius Stost. They never spoke of a next mission. There wouldn't be one. Their lives were no longer measured in targets or maps. They were measured in cups of coffee, in quiet mornings, in the knowledge that they had done something few ever dared to do. They had pulled truth from the depths and let it breathe, no matter the cost. That spring, for the first time in years, Wade planted seeds. Not metaphorical ones, real ones. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs. He didn't know if they'd grow, but he planted them anyway. Because maybe the real mission now was this: to remain. To live truthfully in the ruins of what had once been hidden. To tend to the soil, not because it would reward them, but because it had been scorched and deserved a chance. By the time summer pressed its warmth into the hills, the air had changed. The silence no longer felt heavy, no longer hung over Wade and Caleb like unfinished business. It had softened, become companionable. The forest around them came alive in deep greens and layered hums of insects and birds. Wade would sit on the porch in the early morning, sipping coffee as the mist retreated, and realize that his breathing had changed. Slower, less burdened. The tension that had clung to him for years like a second skin was loosening. The past hadn't vanished. It never would. But it no longer dictated his every step. Caleb, however, had begun to move more carefully. His energy, once sharp even in silence, was now measured. His hands trembled more often, and sometimes his thoughts drifted mid-sentence, leaving him staring at the horizon like he was watching something only he could see. Still, he never complained. He didn't ask for help, didn't speak of pain, and didn't accept pity. He tended to his bees, tinkered with tools, and sometimes stood by the edge of the woods, as if remembering the layout of a long-lost battlefield. Wade watched it all with a quiet kind of heartbreak, understanding that some wars followed a man until his last step. One evening Wade found him in the workshop, seated on a stool, hands folded neatly in his lap. On the table in front of him was a small wooden box, freshly sanded and sealed. When Wade approached, Caleb looked up and said only, "It's ready." Inside the box were the most important artifacts of their story. A copy of the second drop, now decrypted and reassembled. A printed transcript of Caleb's recorded statement. The letter from Wade's sister. Clippings from the local article. And, nestled at the bottom, a simple envelope containing a folded American flag, not from a casket, but from a deployment once filled with purpose, before the mission became corrupted. "I want you to bury it," Caleb said. "Not now. Someday, when you know it won't be lost." Wade nodded. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, just understanding. Weeks passed in slow rhythm. The garden began to flourish in bursts of color and scent. Bees buzzed heavier in the air. Rain came often and gently. The world continued its movement, and in its corners, small signs of change began to appear. Policies rewritten quietly, oversight strengthened, whistleblower protections debated again on the floor of the Senate. Most of it wouldn't make the news. Most people wouldn't connect those changes to two men in a cabin who had once disappeared for telling the truth. But Wade and Caleb didn't need recognition. They needed only to know the tide had turned, even if slightly, because they had pushed against it when no one else dared. Then, one morning in early July, Caleb didn't come down for coffee. Wade knocked on his door, lightly at first. When there was no response, he pushed it open. The window was cracked to let in the breeze, and Caleb lay in bed, peaceful, arms crossed, eyes closed like he was simply resting. There was no note, no final message, just the faint scent of cedar from the wood box and the open page of his journal resting on the nightstand. Wade sat beside him for a long time, hand on his shoulder, feeling the strange stillness that comes when a man who's lived through too much finally lets go. He didn't cry, not then, not for hours. But when the sun rose higher and poured through the window in thick golden light, Wade buried his face in his hands and allowed the silence to break. He buried Caleb beneath a cluster of trees on the southern edge of the property, where the bees drifted lazily through tall grass and the wind rarely disturbed the soil. He marked the grave not with a cross or a stone, but with a wood box, sealed tight and placed into the ground beside him. The truth would rest there, with the man who had carried it the longest, a capsule of memory and courage, hidden where it could wait for someone else, someday, to find it. After that, the days were quieter. Wade continued the routines. He tended the garden, maintained the cabin, and kept the bees. He also wrote long, unfiltered letters to no one in particular. He sent a few to Isla, though he didn't expect a reply. He sent one to the young man at the Cincinnati train station, addressed only as, "For Jay, if you ever come looking." And he wrote one final letter to Julia, his sister, telling her everything. Not in technical terms or strategic briefings, but as a brother who had finally understood that truth wasn't about exposure alone. It was about what you built after the secrets were no longer necessary. Years passed. Slowly, steadily. Wade's hair grayed, his steps slowed, but the world around him shifted too. New legislation passed. A memorial wall was erected in D.C., honoring those who served and vanished. It didn't list names, but it told the story. A plaque beneath it read, "In memory of those whose silence was not consent, but sacrifice." Wade visited it once, wearing a worn jacket and a ball cap pulled low. He stood there for nearly an hour, watching strangers pass by without knowing what they were seeing. One young woman, perhaps a student, read the inscription aloud. Her friend asked what it meant. She answered, "I think someone made sure we knew the truth, even when it cost them everything." Wade turned then, walked away into the crowd, and disappeared again. Not to hide, not anymore, but because his part was finished. The truth had found its voice. The world had heard it, and somewhere in the woods, under the steady buzz of bees and the rustle of trees, a legacy remained, not etched in stone, not shouted from podiums, but grown in soil, guarded in silence, and carried forward by those who refused to forget, and who had survived the war. He had survived the silence, and now, finally, Wade could simply live. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.